Hey, I'm Andy. Welcome to the Church Basement. I read a bunch of books in 2023. I like reading, I like talking about reading, and I like recommending books that I enjoyed. So I decided, why not make a video about it? That said, here are my top books I read in 2023. The Second Mountain by David Brooks. Man, this book really surprised me. A friend recommended this. I got a copy from the library, and after about 2 days, I got my own copy so I could write in it and highlight it all up. So what is the second mountain? Well, David Brooks first describes the first mountain, which is individual success, fulfillment, and happiness. Brooks' argument, which I tend to agree with, is that living your life on the first mountain stinks. In his words, the emphasis of self, individual success, fulfillment, individual freedom, self-actualization is a catastrophe. Yeah, my own experience is that this momentary happiness is really at the expense of long-term joy. And what I think Brooks argues really well is that this isn't just the result of being young or being selfish. Our whole society is set up to encourage and support this idea of hyper-individualism. From a young age, you're told this is what the good life looks like, feels like, now go get it. And we climb the first mountain only to be let down and realize this stinks, and we end up in a valley. He says society has produced a world of insecure overachievers. That phrase pretty much sums up what I was like most of my life. And we chase momentary happiness, but eventually experience this letdown and a sense of dread and joylessness. The fallout, a loneliness crisis, distrust in everyone and everything, a lack of meaning and purpose, and tribalism, which he defines as the dark twin of community. Brooks sees 4 areas of commitment as the way to live less individually and more for others, less for in-the-moment happiness and more for long-term joy. Their vocation, marriage, faith, and community. And while I have my own beliefs about all these concepts and ideas, I found myself agreeing with so much of what Brooks wrote in this book. And I found myself making noises like, and, ah. So who's this for? I think the younger you are, the better, because it serves more as a warning and a parable for what you're stepping into rather than what it was for me and people who are older, which is a been there, done that story. But even if you've already experienced the disillusionment of the first mountain, I found that there was just so much good truth in here, and I really just enjoyed it. Timothy Keller by Colin Hanson. No one has influenced my views of the gospel more than Tim Keller. His book, Reason for God, was the first book I read as a Christian, and it really just opened up my eyes to the world of apologetics and rational arguments for Jesus. So right away as a new Christian, he became very influential. I've read almost all of his books and listened to countless sermons. And this book actually highlights the influences on his faith that molded him throughout his lifetime. Someone once described building a family tree of all the influential people in your life. So you have the people that influenced you, and then it branches out into the people who influenced them, and you keep going. And when you do that, you get a real good understanding of the foundation that your beliefs and your thoughts are built on. This book did that for me, and it gave me a lot of insight into all the people and all the thinkers that have influenced the way I see, think, and follow Jesus. So I actually finished this book just weeks before Timothy Keller passed away from a long battle with cancer. And I think the timing of reading this book added to the impact that it had on me. Reading about someone's life and then seeing all the outpouring of love and respect online when he passed away, it reminded me how fortunate I am and so many others were to have Tim Keller and all the resources that he put out. So who's this for? Anyone who puts Tim Keller up there in their list of favorite speakers, pastors, writers. And I'd also add young pastors or people in seminary so they could get a view of what a faithful life in ministry looks like and how it was lived out. Tim Keller, truly an awesome dude. And actually one of his books made my list for the year. It's Forgive by Tim Keller. One of the things I love about Keller is his focus on the gospel and how he explains the commands and obedience as a response to the good news. Based on what's been done for us, this is how we respond. And because of what's been done for us, we can do what Jesus calls us to do because we're freed, forgiven, and empowered to do it. Now, I'll admit, one of the things I love about Keller is that he gets me thinking. I love thinking about all this stuff, the implications, the truth, all of that. But because of that, it's really easy to get stuck intellectualizing everything. But this book does not let you do that. Personally, I think this is Tim Keller's most practical book, which makes sense because forgiveness is something we do. But it's also not something we know exactly how to do. So, what does it mean to forgive according to Tim Keller? Well, here's how he sums it up. Keller explains forgiveness using a parable that Jesus told in Matthew 18. It's about a king who settled accounts. From it, he gives several key points that describe the process of forgiveness. He says forgiveness starts with truth-telling, with exposure rather than a cover-up of excess or half-truths. He says you have pity, meaning you deliberately do the internal work of understanding the perpetrator's situation, the perpetrator's vulnerability. As Keller points out, this is not a natural thing to do, but it is essential to forgiveness. Then he points out we have to cancel the debt, and this is the heart of forgiveness. Keller says, forgiveness means that when you want to make them suffer, instead you refuse to do it. And this refusal is hard. It is difficult and costly, but through it you are absorbing the debt yourself. Then we let them go, we release them from the debt with the hope of restoring the relationship. In the book, Keller reminds us that forgiveness also includes restoration and justice, and these things are all navigated together. He says forgiveness and justice must go hand in hand. In fact, if you don't forgive the person, your justice seeking will likely veer into the territory of revenge. Besides defining and offering practical steps on how to do forgiveness, Keller addresses the cultural ideas about forgiveness and cancel culture, what he calls the new shame and honor culture. Basically, from a Christian perspective, you have behaviors that are wrong or sinful, but there's repentance and forgiveness and hopefully restoration, which is how we deal with this. Culturally, we have behaviors that are tolerated and those that aren't. But there's no forgiveness in the equation. There's acceptance and there's condemnation, and that's sort of it. A society that lacks forgiveness and any way of restoring people and moving forward doesn't encourage better behavior. It increases shame, it increases hiding, and it decreases vulnerability. Because people aren't perfect, they will always need forgiveness. I appreciate that he addressed this in the book because I don't think forgiveness is something we should consider a weakness or something wrong that we do, but rather it's something that takes courage and strength, and it allows people to heal and grow and restore relationships. So who's this book for? I think this is really for all believers, but especially those people who need to forgive, which is a lot of us. Personally, this book helped me make progress and really move through the process of forgiving some people that had been on my to forgive list for quite a while. So if you're someone that has some resentments, this book is probably worth checking out. So one of my goals for the year was to read as much C.S. Lewis as possible. I'd read Mere Christianity years ago when I was investigating Jesus, and it helped me unbelieve a lot of the nonsense that I was believing at the time about Christianity. Also, when I was a pastor and I was preaching and I was teaching, I would quote C.S. Lewis quite a bit, but I hadn't actually read any of the books that I was quoting from. So I decided this was the year when I was going to dive in. Basically, all the books I read were great, but one stood out, and that was The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. Here is how Lewis describes the problem of pain. He says, if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. This is the problem of pain in its simplest form. At some point, people have to wrestle with what they see and what they experience in the world. Pain, suffering, sickness, death, all of that. And it can be a pretty big hurdle, not just to believing in God, but especially to believing in a good God. This is a pretty big challenge, but C.S. Lewis takes it on and he handles it really, really well. One of his most famous quotes actually comes from this book. He says, "We can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." I would say this book really shows why C.S. Lewis is considered one of the best modern apologists. He's clever, he's thoughtful, he gets the complexity of life, he's smart, he's way smarter than me, but he still says things simply and concisely. This book might not be the best book to read while you're going through a challenge or difficulty or pain or suffering, but it's definitely a book to read at some point when you're not. Having gone through my fair share of self-inflicted misery from all the wrong that I've done in my life, I found myself nodding as I read one of my favorite lines from this book. C.S. Lewis says, "The creature's illusion of self-sufficiency must, for the creature's sake, be shattered." Who's this for? Everyone. Short of Glory by Mitchell Chase. This entire book is on Genesis 3. And I don't care how weird it sounds, but Genesis 3 is one of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible. Because Genesis 3 provides so much understanding about the world that we currently live in. As Chase says, the beginning implies an ending. Genesis 3 is really where the story begins. In here, Chase explains God's intention to dwell with us in a sacred place, wisdom of creation, the serpent, human desires, shame, fear, Adam's role, Eve's role, offering and sacrifice, humanity after the fall, and how all of this comes together and leads us to Jesus. One of my favorite lines from this book comes from the chapter on shame, where he says, "As we are, we cannot dwell with God as he is, and so we hide." Thankfully, God has done something about this situation, which Chase explores in every chapter and connects the dots from Genesis 3 to Jesus. So who's this for? Anyone that is interested in the biblical narrative. If you're a Christian, then Genesis 3 is the beginning of the story of redemption. Genesis means origin, and Genesis 3 is where we find the origin of the bad news, which is what the good news is dealing with. Great book, really easy to read, highly recommend. And finally, Sonship by Surge Ministries. This is not really a book, this is a study. And I mean this. This is the best study I've ever done. Heads up, there are MP3 files that you have to download from the website, which you actually have to buy, which I didn't know about, but it's all okay because it was worth it. You download the MP3. MP3, it's like I'm living in the 2002s. You listen to it. That sort of is the teaching. You read the chapter. It's awesome. At its core, this book is about adoption into God's family, which I think is an idea and a concept of the gospel that just isn't explored enough and is huge because of the implications about our identity. I went through this at about one chapter a week during the summer, and it gave me a lot of insights into my thoughts and my beliefs and areas where I still struggled to believe and accept the gospel and how I could move forward and trust Jesus more. There's some exercises in this book that are just awesome, and all of them have to deal with the gospel. They dive into what our words say about what's going on in our heart. We're given exercises where we actually have to teach people key concepts of the gospel. We get feedback from people about areas of our life where we need a change. And there's countless questions that help us just dig in and find out what we truly believe and how we can further believe the good news. I was honestly super surprised how good this book was, but if you go on Amazon and you just read the reviews, you'll see I am not alone. Who's this book for? Anyone that wants to explore how to make the gospel part of their day-to-day living, which is really what I think being a believer is all about. Believing, not just once, but every single day. Sonship, check it out. So those are my top books that I read in 2023. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've read any of them, or let me know what your top books were for the year. Check them out if you're interested. I have links down in the description. Thanks for watching. See you next time.